right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to Emergency Preparedness and Response. This is a 6-part series that we're offering. The first today is threat identification and risk assessment. So thank you all for being here. I want to thank our partners, Florida Humanities, the National Endowment for the Humanities, FEMA's Heritage Emergency National Task Force, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, Visit Florida, Society of Florida Archivists, and the Florida Museum. Funding for this program is provided by a grant for the Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So thank you again to all of our sponsors that help make this possible. My name is Carmen Godwin. I'm the FAM program manager. Thank you so much for being here. Just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share it with you after. How the agenda will work is we have 2 segments and 2 parts. So we have 2 speaker segments, and in each one of those we'll have a Q&A where you can get your questions answered. And then we also will have 2 breakout sessions. Well, we will ask you a question and have you work with some of your colleagues to get that question answered. For the Q&A segment, you can use the chat box at any time, and I will make sure that your questions get answered. Or during the session itself, you can unmute yourself and ask the speaker the question directly. So either one of those ways will work. In the chat box, keep an eye out for resource links. We have multiple resource links that we will be sharing with you. And then finally, we'll send you an email after this program that will include the recorded webinar, as well as a short survey. It'll just take 2 to 3 minutes to fill out. That survey really helps us not only understand how this program went, how we can improve upon it, but also other programs that you'd like to see us offer in the future. The programs that we're offering today were things that you told us you needed. So please let us know what kinds of programs you'd like to see in the future. So I'm going to welcome our speaker, Elise Lecomte. She is the Registrar and Coordinator of Health and Safety for the Florida Museum of Natural History. She currently serves as an AAM MAP and accreditation reviewer, the ARC Secretary, and the SCMC Council member and Career Center Coordinator. She has served in multiple positions throughout museums in the state of Florida. And she is an expert presenter for sessions, workshops, webinars on collections management, emergency preparedness, exhibit design, and policy development. We are very proud to have her here today to share her expertise with us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point and have her share hers.
Thank you, Carmen, for those nice words. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for attending today. I don't know if it's a rainy day where you are. It is here, so this is a nice thing to do on a rainy morning. Today's program is going to focus on threat identification and risk assessment. And these are 2 of the preliminary steps for creating an emergency preparedness response and recovery plan for your institution. Now, I wanted to say in my role as Museum Health and Safety Coordinator that here at the museum and at the University of Florida, for the museum, I oversee all aspects of health and safety for both the staff and the collections. And this includes development of the museum's emergency preparedness plan, annually updating the plan, writing protocols and procedures, and planning and coordinating our emergency response and recovery procedures. Now, emergency planning has 2 goals. One is a contingency plan designed to take effect when an unforeseen event strikes or is imminent. And 2, a longer-term mitigation actions undertaken to minimize the impact of an anticipated event. In order to develop a contingency plan and identify required mitigation actions, we first have to identify the threats to which our institutions are susceptible. According to the Getty Institute's text, Building an Emergency Plan, a threat is defined as an indication of imminent danger. To me, that is such a short, innocuous definition for an event that has a potential to be catastrophic if we have not planned properly for its possibility. To know what to plan for, an important first step in the process is to have a good idea of what dangers threaten us and our institutions. Threats come from many different sources, as you can see here, and in many levels of severity. Some are a result of nature's wrath, but as you can see from this slide, most of them are man-made. Some threats fall into more than one category. For example, a fire can pose a minor threat that only affects part of the institution, or it can be a catastrophic event that affects most all of the institution and possibly the community or region. Most of the sources of natural threat are well known, and by using our common sense, we can figure out what the results of such a disaster might be at our institution. For example, a hurricane will probably bring some level of wind, water, and structural damage. By examining your facilities carefully, you can easily figure out what might happen to your institution. For example, the walls of your structure may be able to withstand the onslaught of wind and water during a hurricane, but what about your roof? What about the building penetrations like windows and doors? For example, loading dock doors are very susceptible to penetration. They're not very robust, and they are a source that should be looked at. Due to the nature of the loading dock's construction of the loading dock door, it can easily be twisted and or ripped from the building during storms with high winds. Some of the man-made sources of disaster are well known and unfortunately may be fairly common to some of us. A busted pipe inside or outside of the building, a leaky roof or window, inadequate wiring, a mold outbreak, or a pest infestation. Other threats may never occur to us until we are actually in the throes of an emergency created by one of these threats. An insect sting causes someone to go into anaphylactic shock. A caterer's hot plate starts a fire. An educational demonstration using an open flame or hazardous chemicals goes awry. Some human threats, like nearby industrial accidents, active shooters, and bomb threats, have only recently invaded the hallowed halls of museums and cultural institutions. Witness the shooting at the Holocaust Museum in 2009. In terms of severity, what might have been a minor incident that would have involved only a small part of the facility can quickly become a catastrophic event leading to the total destruction of the institution without proper emergency planning. This slide reiterates some potential threats, natural and human, big and small, that we might have to deal with at some point in our professional careers. Forest or brush fires, hail, combustible decorations used for an event, educational demonstrations, or sewage backup, to name a few. While many disasters remain out of our control, the ability to prepare and respond to them properly and effectively is within our control. Back in 2012, I gave a similar presentation for FAMS Connecting to Collections, developing an emergency preparedness plan. I was surprised to find out that fire is the #1 threat to cultural institutions. It does the most damage to the institution, both in terms of the amount lost and the cost, than any other threat, natural or man-made. And here on the slide, you can see the fire at Notre Dame and a fire that occurred this year at the Historic Mission in California. This slide shows some of the flood damage that the Randall Research Center headquarters, a Pine Island satellite facility of the Florida Museum of Natural History, suffered as a result of Hurricane Charlie. This is a prep lab at the facility that used to be a garage. A thick, hardened sludge covered the floor and bottom inches of the walls and the furniture and equipment that were in the lab. Artifact bags stored on the bottom shelves of racks and cabinets were inundated with water. We actually learned that we had not stored things high up enough off the ground. And you can see that this shelving unit is actually off the ground, but only by probably less than an inch. So we should have moved everything off these bottom shelves. We did not realize that the water would go inside this cabinet due to the way that it closes, but this was filled with water and everything, all the bags in there were full of water. This slide shows roof and chimney damage as well as structural damage to the Randall Research Center headquarters building. On February 22nd, 2011, a 6.3 magnitude earthquake struck Christchurch at 12:51 p.m. Central City was badly affected with damage to buildings and infrastructure already weakened by the magnitude 7.1 earthquake of September 4th, 2010, and its aftershocks. Many of the city's heritage buildings were affected, with some later having to be demolished. And this is a photo from the web of damage to the Christchurch Cathedral after the 2010 earthquake. This is a photo that I took while I was visiting in 2018. You can see that the towers were destroyed by the 2011 earthquake. And 7 years later, this structure has not been renovated at all. It may never be, it may be, they may have money to do it, but it's very difficult to come back from such catastrophic destruction. This is a photo of from the mountains outside of Christchurch of the city as the earthquake was going on, and you can see all of the dust from the rubble as buildings were demolished by the earthquake. Biological damage can take several forms, including mold and insect damage. You can see mold here on the Native American basket. And on this mask, this Balinese mask, the interior wood of the mask's nose was eaten away by bugs. But that wasn't visible until somebody picked this up improperly and their finger punched through the very thin exterior surface that was remaining after the bugs had eaten the interior of the nose. So any questions on identifying threats? I see there's things in the chat. Let's see, mostly that's the resources that Carmen put up.
Yes, so about threats, do we have any questions? If you can ask a question in the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Elise a question directly about this section of the program, you can go ahead and do that now. Okay, I don't hear anybody. All right, so we are gonna, right now, we're gonna move into a breakout session. Elise, do you wanna ask the question or would you like me to?
I could do that. So for the breakout session, the question, some hazards and threats are large scale while others are localized, which we discussed in the presentation. So take a few minutes to name as many hazards or threats to your institution that you can think of. Then take a few more minutes to rank the top 3 for your institution.
So we have breakout rooms. Each of you it'll be about 3 to 4 people per breakout room. I would encourage you to make sure that your video is on, and at the very least that you are unmuted when you go into the breakout room. If you have any issues and you can't hear anyone, you can come back to the main room and I will make sure to get you reassigned. We'll give you 10 minutes to answer this question. And I will put the question in the chat box so that you have it once you go into your breakout room. And then we'll come back to hear the second part of the session and report back. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. We're just waiting a few more seconds for everybody to join us back in the main room. All right, everybody should be back now. So I think what we'd like to do, what Elise and I discussed, was just having each group, if you could remember what room number you were in, if a representative from each group could kind of report back to us what those top few things were that you ranked, and maybe they were different for different people in your group, but if we could have one representative from each room. Anybody in room 1 want to unmute themselves and let us know what they came up with?
Hi, yes, I was in group 1 with Suzanne and Anna and Emily. And we were all from different type of institutions, whether it's a historical society, library with art on the walls, and of course their books as well. Or also I think they were working with Ponce Inlet, and they were working with the historical building there. We all sort of came to the conclusion, especially living in Florida, that hurricanes, wind, water damage, fire, as well as mold. And then we also decided that for myself as an art institution, and also with the Tampa Library branches, they have art on the walls as well. And, you know, there's always human accidental things happening with an umbrella or a backpack. So that's also not necessarily a heavy threat, but it's maybe a minor situation.
All right, great. That's fantastic. Anyone from room number 2 want to unmute yourself? That was Barbara, Jason, Judy, or Kristen. All right, we can come back to you. Room number 3, we have James, Nancy, or Stephanie. Anybody want to unmute yourself?
I think I'm unmuted.
Yes,
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, this is Nancy. Just James and I were on there, and he's in Tallahassee, and sounded like a concern that he's got, or that they have, is trying to digitize historic documents so that at least you've got those for the future, which is something that I'm struggling with. Small museums seem to do that, but I've got sea level rise, hurricane. Obviously, here in Panama City, we were hit by Hurricane Michael, and our museum took a big hit. I have gas station next door. We're right on a street corner where I think a vehicle could crash. So those are kind of the things that we talked about.
Okay, thank you. Room 4, Emery or Shelby? Do either of you want to unmute yourself? Hey, Emery.
Hi. So we too, Shelby being at the IMEG History and Science Center up in Fort Myers, and I'm at the Stonewall National Museum and Archives down in Fort Lauderdale, concerned as well about hurricanes, of course, and flooding. Unfortunately, she had experience with flooding due to a sprinkler issue, so equipment malfunction, and also molds were a concern. We've had questions about molds, and one issue was raised in that we do receive a lot of donations both to our library and archive that come in and out of people's homes, and so with that, pests or again molds, we talked a little bit about possibilities of targeted violence as well, whether from homophobia or issues surrounding racial injustice. Topical items for today.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Emery. Room 5, Julia, Keith, Kristen, or Stephanie?
This is Julian. I have the pleasure of working with Keith, and I'll say a few words, and I would like Keith to continue after me. So I'm from Ormond Beach Historical Society. Ormond Beach, Daytona Beach, this is an area for those of you who are not familiar. Major hurricane, flood, wind, and of course fire. Interesting point is that we have two historic buildings built in 1880s, and they never been flooded, even down the bank. One is on the Halifax River, one is very close to the ocean. So, but preparedness is very important, and I am one of the very few professionals, so I'm determined to work on the disaster preparedness and, most importantly, the emergency plan. From everything that I've been told, I need at least one page straight on point what to do in line of communication. So I would like to invite Keith if he would continue.
Yes, this is Keith. I'm from the Appleton Museum in Ocala, Florida. And yes, just like Julie was mentioning, the major threats would be hurricane, wind damage, rain as well, leaks, and ceilings type thing. Also being here in Florida, with it being so hot and humid, insects are always concern, infestation possibly, and of course fire is always a threat, I think, for any institution as well.
All right, thank you, Julia and Keith, both of you. Room 6, Brianna, Jonathan, Patricia, or Richard?
Brianna, Patricia, you want to go? This is Rick. Jonathan wasn't able to join us, but I think he was listening in. Brianna, you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure, I will. I don't mind. So I think, as has been the commonality since we all do live in Florida, hurricanes was in the top of our conversation list. Of course, that comes with flooding and wind and such like that. For us, for myself in particular, we're not in a historic building, but we are in an older building. So we had conversations about, facility failures and, leaking from the roof, even on a heavy raining day, of things of that nature. Something interesting that I thought we talked about was in that same vein of civil unrest, active shooter, and vandalization, I guess if that's a word, from homeless community. So Patricia said they're in a downtown area, as are we, with a high homeless population. So the potential threat of things being vandalized was a point of conversation. So, but again, I think the big points was the hurricane, as with mostly everybody else. So did I miss anything, Richard, Patricia?
No, I think that's got it. Our biggest at the St. Augustine Lighthouse is hurricane, wind, water, including humidity in the water thing. I kind of joined that in there because it's been an issue with damaging windows in the keeper's house. But we did talk quite a bit about I had to add to our disaster plan the active shooter and civil unrest parts when we went through AAM accreditation a few years ago. And it's becoming more and more of an issue as far as concern that you have covered that in your disaster preparedness plans.
Thank you so much. And finally, room 7, Deb, Ellery, Tina.
So Patricia from the last group is actually our executive director, so you might get a little
okay.
But our three museums, we all have multiple historic buildings. So all three of us were discussing the water damage that you can get. We're all by the water. We're all either by a river or the ocean. And then the structural damage each building can sustain, because they're all different buildings, whether they're built at different times or built from different materials. And the humidity is a big thing for, like one of the other groups said, when you lose electricity or when you lose power or if there's leakage, what do you do with the humidity when it starts rising? Tina and we both have large photograph collections, so fire is also a bit of a concern. And she gave me a very good idea about fireproof filing cabinets. So I was very appreciative of that. So yes, but along the same veins as all the other groups have been discussing, the weather specifically and structural damage and things like that.
That's great. Thank you so much, all of you. I did want to, we have one comment in the chat box I just want to read aloud because we have somebody, Joseph Prosser, wasn't able to participate because he was having some technical difficulty. But I just wanted to read his comment, which is, the threats mentioned are both immediate and subacute fire mold. It's interesting that no one has mentioned the pandemic, which is a risk to our staff, as well as our guests, and of course, our economic viability, which I'm sure all of you are suffering with as well. Throughout the state. All right, thank you so much. We have another breakout session that will build on this after Elise provides her presentation on risk assessment. So Elise, do you want to take over?
I do. Yeah, thanks, Carmen. But I have a few comments. If nobody has any questions from the breakout.
Do you have any questions?
Okay, so I have a few comments. I put a few comments in the chat box as people were talking, but I also wanted to highlight a few things that several people didn't comment on: the civil unrest and the vandalism. One of the issues that we have being on a university campus is the possibility of bomb threats and the active shooters. And fortunately, we have had several occurrences of active shooters on the campus, not near the museum, but, and they were promptly taken care of by the University Police Department. But that's a big concern for us. Rick mentioned the lighthouse, and the problem with being near the ocean, for all of you near the ocean, is not only water, but the fact that it's salt water. And salt water causes a lot more damage than rainwater, regular water. Security is a big concern. The art libraries that mentioned having art, and I'm sure they're aware of this, that theft is a possibility in that case. One of the biggest threats that we have here at the museum, the Collections and Research Building, is on a hill, on a very steep hill. And so we have very little water intrusion when we have hurricanes. We do have some, because the water comes in at the top of the building, leaks down through the berm, the dirt berm, and comes in down in through the walls. But we don't get a lot of flooding in the building from that. We did have one of the hurricanes, we had an occasion where there was flooding at the bottom of the hill. All the water ran down and piled up at the bottom on the road, and you couldn't get through that way. The biggest problem that we have are leaks caused by old piping in the building. It was built in the 70s, and we have several places in the building where consistently we get leaks. And so we've found different ways to mitigate that, including keeping the areas covered with plastic, working with the physical plant division, facility services, to try and rectify the problems with the piping and the air conditioning units that are spread throughout the building. The pans underneath the drains stop up and the pans fill up and leak, so overflow. So that's just a few things, few comments. It's good to see that there are people from so many different places and different kinds of institutions today. I'm going to stop share and bring up the next presentation. And okay, so now we're going to talk about risk assessment. Once we've identified the threats, where do we go from there? Oops. By identifying threats and associated risks, organizations are finding that they can target resources to protect people and property more efficiently through the planning process. In doing so, risks are prioritized and more substantial threats are managed before the lesser ones. Risk assessment and risk management are used in a variety of contexts. For example, to ensure adequate health and safety measures are in place for staff and visitors, and to inform business planning, and to develop an effective emergency plan. We make risk assessment and risk management decisions at work every day. Some of these decisions are guided by established procedures, but many simple decisions are guided by individual experience and an instant judgment. Planning for the long term and allocating budgets for maximum benefit requires a more systematic approach to assessing and managing risk, and needs risk assessment decisions to be recorded and collated so they can be analyzed and referred to during the process and at a later date. Here are a few definitions. Risk is the chance or likelihood of the threat or an unwanted event occurring. Risk management involves identifying, assessing, and prioritizing risks. The identified and prioritized risks then informed a planned program to minimize and control the probability and impact of identified threats to the collection or to the institution. Risk assessment is an activity to calculate an objective view of the magnitude of the risk to the collection or institution. It includes an analysis of the probability and the likely impact of an unwanted event or threat. The first step in a risk assessment is to identify and list the potential threats to your collection, and as we've seen already in the presentation today. This may vary from building to building and possibly from room to room. Risk assessment may be carried out on a whole building, a specific store or display area, or an object or group of objects, depending on the need. Each assessment will be different. There are three components to assessing potential danger to an institution. Hazard, that is the probability that a disaster will occur. Vulnerability, that is the degree of exposure to a hazard and the amount of loss from a disaster. And risk, that is a probable loss from a disaster as determined by considering the hazards of a location and the vulnerability of the assets located there. Risk assessment relies on hazards and vulnerability analysis, determines acceptable levels of risk, and thereby provides a basis for making decisions about which preventive measures are needed. Without having a personalized assessment of your institution's risks, you won't know what to cover in your emergency preparedness plan. A scenario planning for risk management begins with developing a comprehensive list of threats. What major interruptions to business should occur, such as natural disasters or facility collapse? What threats are there to health and safety of staff and visitors, such as slips, falls, or dangerous chemicals? Are the collections at sudden risk in any way, such as power failure or theft? The hazard assessment determines the kinds of threats to which an institution is exposed and the likelihood of their occurring. The more ways that an event, such as water damage, can occur under different types of circumstances, the greater the probability that it will occur, and thus the greater the risk. When assessing risk, always imagine a worst case scenario. Consider the impact of the event. How damaging will it be to finances, mission, and reputation? And how often does such an event occur? Vulnerability analysis assesses the kind and extent of damage that a given hazard might do. We may be able to do very little to change our exposure to hazards, but we can certainly do a great deal to reduce our vulnerability. And you can see here from the photos, this is an old newspaper account of a hurricane that occurred in the early 1900s. or 1945, and then this is damage from Hurricane Andrew. Consider the impact of the event. Sorry. Reducing vulnerability to disasters involves the following 4 steps: identifying specific hazards, determining broad preparedness goals, evaluating structures and their contents, and taking mitigating action to correct deficiencies. The probability and incident rate of natural disasters locally or within your region can be determined using data from local, state, regional, and national disaster agencies, including the Federal Emergency Management Agency's, FEMA's, Declared Disasters by State website. And I have a slide at the end of the presentation that includes this in the list of references and resources. Another agency to consider is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and other weather-related websites like Weather Underground. Historical records, personal interviews, and newspaper articles can be useful as well. An institutional risk assessment involves a complete examination of an institution's facilities, inside and out, top to bottom, door to door, as well as a critical evaluation of its priorities for dealing with them, and for an evaluation of the policies and practices. Hazards can then be systematically identified and analyzed. Then priorities for dealing with them can be set. Next, actions to prevent or reduce losses and generally prepare for appropriate responses during emergency should be developed and implemented. In 1994, Robert Waller, then chief of the conservation section of the Canadian Museum of Nature, proposed a model approach to performing a risk assessment. He suggested that cultural institutions use a numeric ranking system to set priorities. By deciding what numbers to assign to the risk and vulnerability variables, staff can come to an agreement on the size and importance of each risk. Presenting the results of this kind of a risk assessment, that is one with quantitative data, to the institution's leadership can be a powerful way to get them to devote needed resources to risk abatement. Using these results, management can decide where it should apply the institution's resources to achieve the greatest reduction in risk. So you can see from this slide that Rob divides the types of risks into 3 categories: 1, catastrophic; 2, severe; and 3 is mild or gradual. The color block scale, which you can see in the chart, white is the least important risk, and black is the most important. So for example, at the top section, the risk is physical forces. And there are several different risks within this category: earthquakes, mishandling, poor support. For an earthquake, it is a type 1, a catastrophic event. What's important to control for an earthquake is the location of the structure itself. The rooms within the structure and the policies are not as important for dealing with an earthquake. For mishandling, the specimen itself, policies and procedures are the most important levels of control for controlling the risks of mishandling. This is page 1 of a fillable PDF risk assessment worksheet that is used by the National Park Service. You can download this form from the National Park Service Museum Handbook, Part 1, in its fillable PDF form. Again, the website is listed in the References Resources slide. I apologize for the squeaky noise. There are a lot of people coming and going right now, and they have to go in right by my office. This is page 2 of that same form. Again, it's similar. The risks are, the threats are in these columns, and these are the factors. And then whether or not, let's go back to page 1. Yes, is this a probability? No, it's not applicable. And then any references that the museum handbook part 1 supply for that particular category. The Norfolk Museum and Archaeological Service in Norwich, England, in partnership with the UK Collections Trust, describes the steps for doing a risk assessment in assess and manage risk in collections care. Part of a collections care how-to guide series produced by the Norfolk Museum and the UK Collections Trust. They divide the process into 4 steps. Step 1 involves identifying potential threats. I think you're starting to see a theme here. In step 2, you assign each of the identified risks a risk type number, depending on how frequently they are likely to occur and the severity of their effect on the institution or collections. This risk number allows for quick reference when assessing risks. Identification of this risk type will also be of use in emergency planning as well. And again, similar to Rob Waller's chart, you have number 3, risk type, which is gradual or mild, number 2, severe, and number 1, catastrophic. In step 3, you assess the probability of each threat occurring and the impact that it would have on your institution. The most accurate assessment of probability involves researching existing data about the occurrences of the identified threats, estimating a probability of the occurrence of the identified threats, or a combination of both methods. For museums without access to detailed past reports, condition assessments, excuse me, and environmental records, assessing probability is largely guesswork based on professional knowledge and common sense. Assignment of the impact of risk will be based on factors such as the knowledge of the institution's buildings and collections, and known costs of remedial actions that might be undertaken should the disaster occur. Now think back to the last slide, the type 1, type 2, type 3. Type 1 risks are catastrophic and rare threats. The probability of these events is hard to determine in-house, but it may be possible to obtain information from outside sources like your insurance company or local, state, and federal agencies. Type 2 risks are sporadic and severe threats. The probability of these events can be based on previous experience at your institution and assessing incident reports and institutional records. Type 3 risks are mild and ongoing threats. The probability of these events can be derived from environmental data and knowledge of the effects of environmental conditions on material types. So you can see in this chart that a disastrous impact with a high probability is very damaging, and that's something that should be planned for. So you can see that anything in these categories is high risk and has a potential for large amounts of damage. In step 4, you prioritize and plan to reduce or remove the risks. You can prioritize your high-risk rating threats and establish plans, including the potential cost to reduce or mitigate the risk. A simple plan for mitigation or risk reduction can be added to the risk assessment table with costs to help with decision-making and setting priorities. For complex risks or high-cost projects, more in-depth assessments of the cost and benefits of the mitigation action can be carried out. This might involve researching several risk reduction strategies, pricing them, and trying to gauge their likely effectiveness before deciding on a final recommendation. I'd just like to remind you that this is from an English publication, so the costs here in this table are in pounds. In 2004, historic preservationists, the business community, and local government leaders in Apalachicola joined forces to conduct an initial risk assessment of the historic resources in the town and develop an integrated action plan for community-wide emergency planning. The committee identified these risks that would have the greatest impact on historic structures and other cultural resources. It identified the following hazards: flooding, winds, storm surge, urban fire, economic crisis, and lightning. The committee developed ranking criteria and an Excel matrix to assess the relative risk of the 6 hazards to each identified historic structure. A total risk score was calculated that allowed various historic resources to be ranked relative to the overall group. And again, in this ranking criteria table, you can see that they have the hazards listing here that they identified. Flooding, if the structure is out of the 100-year flood zone and has no history of flooding, it's a mild risk. If it's not in a map zone but has a history of flooding, it's a higher risk. If it's in the mapped 100-year flood zone, it's an extremely high risk, and so on. After completing the risk assessment, the community developed an action plan to integrate historic preservation concerns into community-wide emergency management planning. Using the identified challenges and needs, the committee formulated a series of short-term and long-term goals. Short-term goals included actions that could be reasonably achieved before or during the 2005 hurricane season. Long-term goals included actions that would take additional time or resources to complete. And again, on this chart, you can see some of the issues that they needed to address. For example, create and maintain an inventory of historic resources and what the action plan to address that issue would include. The check mark indicates action plans that were completed during the initial phase of the project, the pilot project. Some aspects of risk assessment are common sense. For example, most of us are capable of spotting fire hazards like frayed wires, too many extension cords, and a lack of enough fire extinguishers. Most of us can identify leaks from worn out roofs, poorly sealed windows, and rusted pipes. Some of us may have seen situations like we see in these photographs in our own institutions. During a risk assessment, or doing a risk assessment, needs to be a group effort. That is, it needs to involve staff members from all areas of the institution. In some cases, it is a good idea to call an expert help with risk assessment. For example, a facilities manager specialist or a maintenance crew from a similar institution, or those from your parent institution. For me, that is the UF Facilities Service Division, formerly called the Physical Plant Division, and the Department of Environmental Health and Safety. You could also call in a police officer to examine security and policies for dealing with violent behavior, a representative from the local fire station crew, a representative from the utility company, a structural engineer, your local state fire marshal, someone from the city, county, or state emergency management agencies. For example, the Florida Division of Emergency Management, CERT with a C, or S, CERT with an S team, that is the county or state emergency response team, and colleagues who have been through actual emergencies. For many of these folks, this kind of service is part of their job, so you will not have to pay them to help. They would rather help you avert a disaster than have to deal with the actual catastrophe and its aftermath. Here I highlight a couple of the case studies from Chapter 1 of the Getty Institute's Building an Emergency Plan that show the identified natural and man-made hazards faced, including hurricanes, floods, fires, earthquakes, windstorms, blizzards, volcanic eruptions, and political demonstrations. This is available as a downloadable PFD. Again, the reference to that and the website address is on the resources and references slide. The result of a risk assessment is to answer the following questions. What is an acceptable risk? What changes can be made to reduce or mitigate the risk? And which alterations are cost effective? Budgeting for risk management is a balancing act between allocating time and money to policies and procedures that avert bad things. For example, installing a sprinkler system, or training, providing the staff with training in first aid and emergency response. And then insurance to make up for the ones that happen anyway. Presenting the results of an institution's risk assessment to the institution's leadership, including management and the board, in a format they recognize as relevant to their responsibilities, for example, preservation of the institution's facilities and collections, can be a powerful way to get them to devote needed resources to risk abatement. Setting priorities for recovery related to threats predicted by your risk assessment will determine what resources and supplies might be needed to cope with identified disasters. The larger the disaster, the further afield you must go to procure resources to deal with it. Minor to moderately sized events that affect only a portion of the institution can be handled with in-house resources, provided that the necessary resources, supplies, designated labor, and funds have been identified, stocked, and set aside. Moderate to larger sized events that impact the entire institution require that resources be garnered from the community, region, or even the state. Community-wide or regional disasters require that resources be procured from the state, region, or even at the national level. It is essential that you identify the source and location of required resources for all of the different types of disasters that you might face well ahead of time. That is to say, when you develop and update your emergency preparedness plans. If you do not, they will not be available when you need them. Many of us have heard horror stories from institutions that did not plan ahead well for the hurricanes. The power was out for months, so there was no HVAC system and no generators available. There was not enough lumber and tarps to cover gaping holes, thereby compromising the institution's security. Not enough food and drinking water to keep cleanup crews going, and not enough dry towels, plastic bags, and boxes to protect water-soaked objects until they could be transported to conservators. You cannot always prevent a disaster, but you can drastically reduce its effect on human life and property. Protective measures are steps taken to eliminate hazards or to reduce the effect of threats. Protection is a long process and one that never ends. Those of us involved in emergency preparedness planning must constantly remind our colleagues that protection is a #1 priority. Planning for protection helps reduce the institution's vulnerability and increases its ability to lessen the effects of threats and to recover quickly from any disasters. During the planning process, short and long-term priorities for protective actions should be set, and budgetary resources should be targeted. It is easier to request funding for specific projects than for an amorphous goal of emergency preparedness. In short, threats to our facilities, our collections, and our visitors and staff are all around us every day, day in and day out. A little prevention goes a long way in saving buildings, preserving our heritage, reducing money spent on repairs, and minimizing recovery time and its associated economic dislocations. With thorough risk assessment and good emergency preparedness planning, we can face what threatens us and our institutions with confidence and come out of a disaster relatively unscathed. These are the references and resources that I used and that I mentioned in this presentation. Whoops. Any questions or comments?
Elise, if you send me a copy of that, I can make sure to get the resource list. I can put it in the email to everybody as well.
Right. I will do that.
Anybody have any questions at this point about risk assessment before we go into the breakout groups? You can either unmute yourself or you can type something in the chat box and I can relay that.
Elise, unfortunately, my internet was out for a moment there at the very beginning. I am wondering, is your presentation available to us in any way, shape, or form?
Carmen may be putting it on the website. If not, I can certainly send you a copy of both my notes and my PowerPoint.
That would be wonderful and much appreciated. I took a lot of pictures, but I think to have the real thing would be way more helpful. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm going to put my, I forgot to put my email on the presentation, so I will put it in the chat box.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm also recording this, so we will have this on our YouTube channel. And I'll send a follow-up email and make sure that Elise's email is on that email as well.
Great, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, I think we can go into our second breakout. Elise, do you want to read this question for the group?
Sure. Consider one of the top 3 threats or hazards that you identified in the previous breakout session. Choose one and discuss what actions you will take now to mitigate that risk and what resources those actions require.
So this is a big question, but I have, just so you know, I have rearranged the breakout groups so that hopefully you're randomly with some other people and you can kind of talk through this. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms just as a reminder, whether you have your video or not, please go ahead and unmute yourself so that you can discuss with the group, and we'll give you about 10 minutes to discuss this particular question. All right, thanks so much. Hello, everybody. Welcome back into the main room. We'd like to go through and again, not everybody joined the room, so you may have only had 2 people in your room. But if you could go ahead and report back out what kind of actions you will take. It's a big question, so we don't expect a super big answer, but and then to mitigate the risk and the resources that you need for that. If I could start with room 1, Nancy or Suzanne.
Hey, this is Nancy. I'm just going to tell mine briefly, and then Suzanne was going to talk about hers. Since I'm in Panama City, we've certainly had the experience of Hurricane Michael. It basically peeled our north roof back just like you would roll up aluminum foil. And we've got a huge collection of historic documents that have got to get digitized. And I think that's a priority on our list, because if we lose them, they're gone forever.
Suzanne, did you have something to add to that?
Sorry about that. Yes, we are in Boca Raton. For us, it's a little bit of different scenario. We have mainly the wind, the water and so forth that we could possibly have in our historic building. I know with the renovation right now, we have impact-proof windows that are being placed. I was talking about the mold as well, and I know our curator is has been looking and has put in place that all our artifacts that are stored are in air-conditioned units. And so that is basically, those were our two big things. And with the renovation, we are trying to cover all our bases so that we are safe in case of a hurricane.
Okay, thank you so much. I did want to mention, you mentioned digitization. We had a webinar last week on digitization, and that video should be going up in the next week. It'll be posted on our website if you need to take a look at that. Room number 2, Petra, Stephanie, or Tina.
I'm going to be speaking up, and Tina, jump in whenever you want to. We didn't see Stephanie in our room, but so we were kind of in similar institution-wise. We do get a lot of support, and actually for Tina in Lake Wales Public Library, she's a department of a municipality, and we are as well with our institution. So we get a lot of help from risk management departments, public works, in terms of insurance and facilities management and maintenance. So, but for us, I think we're both in the same boat in terms of water damage and hurricanes and that sort of thing, fire as well. So for my institution, Coral Springs Museum of Art, one of our biggest threats really is water. And when Tropical Storm Eta came through, we did see some water damage. So for mitigating that, obviously we need to sort of look throughout the whole building. And that's what we did the day after we got back in. We just did a full assessment and we started writing up whatever we needed to get addressed. We wrote to Public Works and they came in and started looking around, and we got dryers in here immediately and assessed humidity levels and so forth within the walls. So insurance is covered by a risk management department in addition to training such as this one. We always make sure we look out for this for all of our employees here. Along with Tina too, I think, she's also in the same boat, right, Tina?
Yes, yes. Yes, very well taken care of by our city's facilities department or risk management. Yes, very proactive.
Yeah. So it was interesting because, again, our institutions are very similar in how we address these situations when we come across them.
Okay, that's great. Thank you both so much. Brianna, Deb, or Rick from group 3.
Sorry, I'm trying to corral a barking dog. Deb joined us. I was with Brown in the earlier session. And we, interestingly, our discussion went to the pandemic and our preparations for the pandemic. And so we talked a lot about what we've done and what we need to do. And it was very similar. I mean, I think we're on top of things. Our site's pretty much quite a bit busier than the others. So, sorry. Brianna, you want to add anything to that so I can mute myself so my doggy doesn't keep barking?
Sure. I think, like Richard said, the point of conversation was towards more so the pandemic. And then towards the end of it, we began talking about, because we all have gift shops, our retail stores in our facilities, and how we're taking and took precautions, whether they're open. I think Deb said their store is not open, but both for us in the Lighthouse, ours have been open since we opened the doors, and how we're taking steps and continuing to take steps for that, and how now we're preparing for the holiday season and people wanting to come and shop more. So what are we doing with all the little touchables and moving things behind the counter that you have to ask for our store associates to then show you? There's not a lot of things that you can handle as much as possible, because the stores are part of our revenue, so we have to make it as accessible as possible. So yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Room 4, Anna, Emery, Kristen. Any of you have something to add?
Sure. It was Anna and I, and we talked about hurricanes and water and humidity. We've got a working plan, and I know Anna is trying to get some things off of the ground there. So we shared our experiences, and I'll kind of go through some tactical things that we discussed. One was Anna shared the experience of an outdoor sculpture that's kind of unique to her organization. But she did need to look at what point does she need to be concerned it has an aluminum top, that it would become a special consideration in high wind. And so she established 74 miles an hour as sort of the breaking point, as pun intended, for how to address this item and protect it and get it inside. And so we talked about kind of setting a hard line for in our institution. We've had circumstances where we drape our library stacks. We both have libraries, and our archival, our shelves in large pieces of plastic, when it passes a certain point. And so what is that point? So we talked about, having a clear definition of the wind speed or amount of precipitation that's expected within a short window of time to determine when we need to break and take those steps. For example, our central air unit became stressed when we had not a hurricane, but just a tremendous amount of rain. And with the clogging, we came in over a weekend to find that there were a few inches of water on the archive. Fortunately, nothing was damaged, but we did need to bring in a dehumidifier very quickly and take some preventive measures so that, we ordered these great products called pig mats that are very inexpensive, but if you're worried that a certain area is going to be stressed or bring in water, they have snakes and mats that absorb large quantities of water in a short period of time. We talked about a drill that she had undergone while up at the Ringling Museum, where they did a salvage practice and went to Goodwill and picked up books and paintings and other items that could be used, and wet the materials, compromise the materials, and then staff and volunteers did drills to clean it up and talk about policy and procedure, which is excellent. And that's something I think that we'll implement here. And also shared a resource, which was the National Heritage Responders Organization. Should budget allow and the need be to bring in an outside consulting group of volunteers to pay them to help clean up materials, there's a phone number where an organization can be brought in, which I wasn't aware of. So all that was very good. Anna, do you have anything to add?
I'm sorry, I was going to say, Anna just put the phone number in the chat box for those of you who'd like to make sure to get a copy of that, the National Heritage Responders phone number.
Yeah, that was perfect, Emery. Thanks. Yeah, I included that. I have that saved in my telephone. I think that everybody should have that saved in their telephone.
That's a great resource. Emery, were you finished with those points? Okay. I think that's a great point, about making sure that you've got some hard and fast rules there. And then also the practice sessions. Those are something that we would like to do more of and kind of help people through as well. So if you have questions about that, that's something that FAM has done in the past, and we can help get you some information on that. Room number 5, Ellery, Emily, or Keith?
So we did not have Emily in our group, but Keith and I discussed hurricanes as well. And it was a good discussion, being as he's in Ocala and I'm here in Fort Lauderdale. So we have different concerns in regards to hurricanes. He was more concerned of the wind speed and high winds and how they can damage this building and how they tape everything up because they have gaps between certain things on the exterior of his buildings. And he hasn't had any flooding issues. They're raised above anything that could cause flooding, and they're not near a large body of water or anything like that. He follows the guidelines of the college and also can rely on the college for any resources that are needed for any hurricane damage, versus us here in Fort Lauderdale. I specifically discussed the fact that our historic buildings are historically designated, and therefore they have to follow the guidelines of the Secretary of the Interior, and we have been working on trying to get hurricane windows that follow those guidelines. installed, which would be completely reliant on us. So there's other things we discussed as well, just ways that we prevent any damage that can be sustained, you know, boarding up our windows, boarding up our doors. He used wooden blocks to make sure nothing, no doors open and blow off and things like that.
Okay, thank you, Ellery. And then finally, room 6, Jason, Julia, or Patricia.
I'll go first, guys. I mean, we did do some hurricane discussion, but since that's been sort of rehashed here a bit, we did chat about, and because I asked in the first group, we updated our collections policy management, our collection policy to meet the CDC requirements for reopening. I don't know if many of you had to do that. We did historic building, you know, obviously none of those chemicals were ever permitted inside. We had to do an adjustment and of course get board approval because all of those documents are approved. So, but I didn't even think about, and now I'm really chewing on this, updating the emergency plan for pandemic because of all the safety concerns and issues we've done now. We're 6 buildings in total. 3 buildings are public buildings for people to view. We have a large research library. So in addition to visitors to a museum, we have library procedures to go through, a lunchroom to go, you know, all those things. And I didn't really, it wasn't even my radar until this meeting to get that updated in the emergency plan. So that was part of our discussion. Of course, the ongoing for us here personally is a sea level rise and the warming climate. That's an ongoing issue. You know, a lot of us are located on bodies of water, and I think that's just going to continue. I know Jason had mentioned that he's from the lighthouse in St. Augustine. They even have a basement, so they have sometimes some concerns about water intrusion there. So that was kind of most of our discussion. You guys chime in if I missed something. Thank you.
Jason, Julia, do you have anything to add? Okay, then we'll move forward. Thank you so much. Elise, do you have any comments or thoughts on some of the things that have been shared with us in the breakout session?
I just have one. Those are great contributions, everybody. But we have an issue here of draping with plastic. We have one room where it takes a village to put the plastic up. And so once we put it up for the first time, we leave it up for the whole hurricane season. And we've developed ways to work around it being up. So that's something you wouldn't think of, might not think of, but it's something we've had to deal with because it's a very big issue to get that plastic up, and even harder to get it down without damaging the objects. So, so once it's up, it's up. I don't have anything else to add. That was a really great discussion. So should we move on to the next?
Yes, the final thing is we would like to make sure that we get all of your questions answered. So again, don't be shy. If you are shy, use the chat box and I will ask your question for you. Or you can just unmute yourself and ask a question of Elise or I at this time.
Elise, I am working on Suzanne from the Boca Historical Society, and I'm working at the moment on the GBAC certification for our museum, which is the Global Biorisk Advisory Council certification. And it has mostly to do with keeping our, on cleaning procedures, disinfecting, and keeping everybody safe when it comes to the pandemic. Or literally COVID-19 and other infectious diseases. Would you say, would that be part of our emergency plan, so to speak?
Yes, that's certainly something that institutions have been adding and should be added for the future, because who knows what's going to be coming at us in the future. And so it's certainly, especially that you've done the work Even if you haven't written it down, you've done it. So write it down and put it in the plan.
Mhm. Yes, I'm only at element 7, which is actually risk mitigation. So this is really interesting. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Does anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask a question at this time?
I have a question. Is anyone here aware of companies or institutions, that have been maybe vetted by institutions like ours, who have worked with, who measure mold particles in the air? We work through in a county building where we know that there's mold in one section of the building because the roof has needed to be repaired, or we saw some indicators in a vent system and whatnot. But it seems to be the kind of thing where once you see it, it's too late. So how can we try to assess what our environment is like from someone who, couldn't, I don't know, we're looking, a resource, like a trusted resource.
Do you have, you said you're in the county agency, right?
We rent a space in a county building. So some of it's our responsibility and some of it's the county's.
Right. So one of the things that I try to do, it's easy for us being on a university campus. We have access to a lot of resources that other institutions don't. But somewhere in the county system, there's probably an agency that deals with hazardous chemicals, hazardous waste disposal, and would have the equipment that's needed to help you try to measure the moisture in the walls of the building and other issues related to possible mold outbreak.
Thank you.
Yeah, so being part of a city or county, we have access to resources within the overall structure of county government, city government. Even there's sometimes state agencies in that county or city that you can call on as well.
That's helpful. Thank you.
And if anybody has any other resources that they'd like to share, you can either type it in the chat box or you can send an email to me. I'll provide my email in just a bit. And I can share those resources with the group as well.
A lot of that stuff you can find with your county emergency management services. If you start there, they can usually point you in the right direction. Just contact your county emergency management, and even your local fire department or fire marshal can usually point you in the right direction for hazmat, which, mold sometimes falls under hazmat issues.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hey, Carmen.
Yes.
This is Nancy in Panama City. I just wanted to bring up something that Suzanne and I were discussing earlier. And you all may already be aware of this, but what we've run into here after Hurricane Michael, our school district was so severely damaged. They had $100 million in insurance to cover repairs to their facilities in this county. It was just a blanket amount. They don't have the money to repair things at what it cost per building. They didn't get that kind of coverage. And subsequently, what has happened is they have $500 million in damage and $100 million of insurance. And one of the facilities was a 1926 historic school that had been restored 20 years ago with historic preservation grants from the state. But they have now given that to the city of Panama City because they can't afford to maintain it. Of course, they've lost 7,000 students, so they need less facilities at this point too. But insurance on historic building, if your museum is a historic building, which ours is owned by the city as well, we have an actual cost to repair it as it exists today. So we're good, but just something for people to think about.
Mhm. That's a really good comment, Nancy, that unfortunately these situations do happen where the area, the region gets a blanket amount. I think the example of the Apalachicola city model might be helpful in certain cases where the community gets together and plans, which buildings are we gonna look at first? Which buildings are we gonna renovate first? Of course, schools are very important and probably would take precedent over certain historic structures, but at least the historic structures would be in there somewhere.
Right.
And their historic Pensacola Village, they might be a good resource to get a hold of. They have an enormous collection of historic structures, and they have a fantastic emergency plan they put together. So they would be an excellent resource on that issue as well. And I can, if you want to email me, I have, my email is actually Carmen, CARMEN @flamuseums.org. I'll make sure to put that in the chat box as well. Any additional questions? Okay. If you do have follow-up questions, I'm sorry, go ahead. I thought I heard somebody. If you do have follow-up questions, please, I'll send you an email so that you all have mine. Follow up with me or Elise. I'll make sure that her email is included in there. In that follow-up email, we will have a survey, as I mentioned before. It'll only take about 2 to 3 minutes to complete, but it really does help us improve our programs and decide what programs we're going to offer in the future. You can look at the programs that we're offering. All of these webinars are free. On our website, flamuseums.org, and then our Twitter and Facebook handle are FLA Museums. On our Facebook, we do have a private group as well, where we, you as professionals can share information or ask questions and that sort of thing of other people in the field. So that's a group that you can also join. The next program is on December 2nd, and it is fundraising for collections. And then the other dates that you see are the remaining 5 programs that are a part of this 6-part series on emergency preparedness and response. So we hope that you'll join us for those. We especially encourage you for the March programs to join with other people from your institution so that you can get in breakout groups and really kind of play out some of these emergency responses with your institution. Any last words, Elise, to the group?
No, I don't have anything else. Thank you all for attending, and please do get in touch with me if you need anything or have any questions.
Thank you again so much, everybody, for attending. We appreciate it.